Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey-Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, January 27th, and we will hear the presentation, Planning for Equity, Supporting At-Risk Communities in Regions That Flood. For any technical questions or content questions related to the presentation, just type those in your Q&A box at any time, and we'll get to the content questions at the end of the presentation during our Q&A. And I will ask, it would help me out if you could tell me who you want to answer the question when you're typing those in. That just helps me. Coming up on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible. Today, we're sponsored by a joint APA division effort spearheaded by the Sustainable Communities Division. And you'll hear more about the Sustainability and Resiliency series here in just a moment. But thanks to you all, as always, for bringing this series to us. Coming up on your screen is a list of our next 3 upcoming sessions. We have webcasts just about every Friday, so you can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Today's session is worth 1.5 credits plus 1 of the required sustainability and resilience credits. You can log them by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our webcast website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And if you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where we post any important date or time changes to our sessions. We post when new sessions are available for you to register, and also your weekly reminder of what's coming up on Friday. We record all of our sessions as well, and we post them onto our YouTube channel. So head over to YouTube and just type in Planning Webcast Series, and we'll pop up along with our well over 400 recordings. This library is available for you for free, always. So be sure to subscribe to our channel so you get notified when new sessions are posted. We generally post our sessions the Monday after, so that's when you can expect to see them. So again, if you have any content questions or tech questions, just type those in the Q&A box. We'll get to your content questions at the end during the Q&A. Now I'm going to turn it over to Carla from the Sustainable Communities Division, who's going to kind of launch in, talk about the S&R series and today's session. Carla.
Thanks, Christine. Christine, we don't see any slides up there, so.
You're kidding.
Yeah, I have a few messages about that.
Thank you for telling me that. Hold on. Let me see what's going on here. How bizarre, but thank you for telling me. How about now?
Looks like it's coming.
Okay.
There it is.
Yeah. Well, luckily you didn't really need to see any of my slides. You just needed to hear what I had to say.
Well, thank you, Christine. And welcome to the Sustainability and Resilience series. I'm Carla Ebenbach with Ebenbach Consulting based in Miami, Florida, and I'm chair-elect of the APA Sustainable Communities Division, and I'm happy to present today's session. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the series and what's coming up. The series was created to provide opportunities for planning professionals to broaden and deepen their knowledge on these subjects while allowing them to earn the mandatory AICP Sustainability and Resilience CM credit live or on demand. And we are so thankful to Christine Dorsey and the Planners webcast series for partnering with us to bring the series to life. The series recordings are a permanent library of resources available for free, thanks to the dedicated efforts of fellow professionals donating their time and their expertise to make the presentations or organize the events. So now available on the YouTube playlist are sessions on extreme weather trends, climate science and planning, the relationship of climate resilience and public health, technology tools, federal funding tools, electric vehicle infrastructure development, a primer for planners on the basics of climate adaptation and mitigation, and most recently, planning for sustainable energy production, a nature-based approach to large-scale solar. So just follow the link shown to find them. Today's recording will be available next week if you have any colleagues who want to see it. And there are more exciting sessions coming up in this calendar year. In March, we have 2 events already scheduled. March 17th, advancing large-scale climate resilient projects through planning and financing with HUD and DOT perspectives. And March 24th, the Climate Planner, strategies for engaging on climate when it's challenging. And other sessions are under discussion as well. So if you're interested in working with a series, please reach out to me and I'll be glad to talk with you more about it. Next slide. So you're about to hear Planning for Equity, Supporting At-Risk Communities in Regions That Flood. Today's session will provide useful information on how vulnerable communities are disproportionately impacted by both increased flooding and the policy and market responses to it. We'll better understand those dynamics and have a look at some real-world examples that illustrate a proactive role for planners in the processes of providing infrastructure, mitigating pressures, building capacity, and responding to emergencies. And of course, as Christine said, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions, and there will be a couple of polling questions, I believe, to get to know you and your needs better. Next slide. Our panelists are experts on this subject, and I'll let them introduce themselves more fully, but we are going to hear from Shannon Zandt, a professor of landscape architecture and urban planning at Texas A&M University. Jaimie Hicks Masterson, Director of Texas Target Communities at Texas A&M. And finally, Dr. Tisha Holmes, Assistant Professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Florida State University. So thanks for attending today, and Christine, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, and Shannon, you are free to share your slides and kick things off.
All right, I'm getting my slides up and hopefully shared. All right, so I think my title's a little off today, but the topic is still the same. I'm Shannon Zandt. As Carla mentioned, I'm a professor of landscape architecture and urban planning at Texas A&M University. I'm also a fellow with our Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center, where my research really focuses on the intersection of affordable housing and disaster impacts and recovery. So I'm going to kind of give you guys a broad overview of some of the equity issues that are inherent in planning for flooded communities that flood, or even more broadly, that are affected by climate change, which at least here in Texas often means more frequent and severe flooding. So just to kind of start, when we think about the flooding issues that are facing our communities, not just along the coast, but also along the coast, we think about that triple threat of climate change in terms of sea level rise, extreme rain events, and surge from increasingly frequent coastal storms. So what you're looking at here is a map of Harris County, which is where Houston is located. Of course, it's along the Gulf of Mexico, and it has a barrier island called Galveston Island, as well as a peninsula, Bolivar Peninsula, but it has a ship channel that runs up right into the county. And really, the whole watershed exposes the city of Houston to frequent flooding. And of course, many of you will remember that Hurricane Harvey struck Houston in 2017, and really it struck Rockport, which is further down the coastal bend south of Houston. But particularly as a flooding event, it came and sat over Houston for several days, dropping nearly 50 inches of rain. And it was just the latest in a series of flooding events that Houston has encountered over the past several years. Of course, Houston gets struck by hurricanes pretty frequently, but it also went through a couple of floods in 2016 and 2015 prior to Harvey that really helped the community understand what was possible. But then Harvey hit and showed us that what we thought could happen was not even close to what really could happen in a place like Houston. So when I talk about this issue, I really want people to understand how our low income and vulnerable communities are particularly exposed to flooding. And so I have a little catchphrase that I use that is not perfectly accurate, but is a helpful way of remembering how this happens. And that is low income households live in low quality homes in low lying areas. And so the logic here is understanding that people and households are going to be different in their capacity to anticipate, prepare for, cope with, respond, and recover from climate disasters like flooding. Excuse me. And we know that not only is their capacity different, but their exposure is different. So they're not randomly distributed. They're concentrated in predictable spatial patterns based a lot on their household characteristics, and particularly based on race, ethnicity, and income levels. Those demographic patterns, things like segregation and concentrated poverty, which I'll talk about a little bit more, are coupled often with the inequitable provision of both affordable housing in the community, but also critical infrastructure like stormwater management and drainage systems. And so those patterns, the demographic patterns, as well as the housing and infrastructure patterns, expose them to flooding and other hazards, and they have both short and long-term consequences for these socially vulnerable populations, including threats to both their health as well as their wealth, given that housing is such an important part of wealth building, particularly for low income and moderate income families. Let's see this slide. Okay, so when we think about that exposure, and that the reason that the low income households and low quality homes in low lying areas is a helpful kind of heuristic is that it identifies those different elements of exposure, where the low income household really refers to social vulnerability. That variation based on race or income or age, gender, household composition, disability, housing tenure, a lot of different vulnerabilities that affect their social vulnerability. They also typically are going to live in lower quality homes that they've acquired through filtering, which is our kind of #1 way of providing affordable housing. Is as wealthier people move up and out into more expensive housing, the housing that they've left behind becomes more affordable for lower income and low and moderate income families. But it's often older, it's often poorly maintained, and it's often in areas that are not equitably served by city services any longer. And then, of course, the low-lying areas really refers to that hazard exposure, where we see repeatedly that low-income and minority neighborhoods are more likely to be located in lower-lying areas. One of the most interesting factoids that came out of Harvey is that the majority of the flooding happened outside the floodplain, and the bulk of it was absorbed by Black and brown families living outside the floodplain, but still in relatively low-lying areas. Where those areas overlap are opportunities for us to actually focus our planning efforts, whether they're mitigation, recovery, or even evacuation and other kinds of social services activities. Social vulnerability, again, I've already mentioned, there are lots of different vulnerabilities. I think I named most of the ones that are listed up there. I always like to highlight race and ethnicity and income because those are the ones that really tend to concentrate people in particular areas, but things even like housing tenure, housing type, whether someone owns or rents, whether they live in multifamily or single family, is also going to increase their vulnerability. Renters, as you know, have very little control over whether they get to stay or whether they're forced out of their housing. They have little control over any mitigation activities that might take place. So those are an additional vulnerability that sometimes we don't think about. And we see repeatedly across the board that these types of social vulnerability are going to lead to disparities in all kinds of things that are important. Certainly the structural quality of the homes, but also people's access to financial resources after a disaster, their involvement in any planning efforts that are taking place in terms of disaster recovery, their civic involvement and whether they feel like they're being listened to, their access to power, those sorts of things, as well as the quality of the insurance that they may have, if they have it at all. And so we see the literature tells us over and over again that these are going to lead to differences in the damage that is received, the length of the recovery process, we see that it sometimes takes 2 to 4 times as long for socially vulnerable households to recover from disasters as it does less socially vulnerable, and also whether they actually ever recover at all, the magnitude of the recovery. And the concerns that we have are permanent displacement of those populations where they never are able to return to their original neighborhoods, and ultimately the exacerbation of pre-existing inequities where they had disadvantages before, but those disadvantages are actually made worse through the recovery period after a flooding disaster. There are lots of causes of this segregation and concentrated poverty, and they both come from the public sector as well as the private sector. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with the private sector obstacles related to historic and contemporary discrimination in the lending and real estate industries, primarily redlining, which has really had a very durable impact on where people are able to live in our communities. And we see that over time, those areas that were redlined in the 30s, 40s, and 50s are still heavily minority and disadvantaged, whereas those areas that were deemed good to blend in and develop in continue to be more affluent and white. We've also seen through the recession that predatory lending can be a problem. And of course, I'm sure all of you are familiar with NIMBY issues that prevent affordable housing from being built in areas that give access to opportunity. On the public sector side, of course, we have a history of racial zoning and those appraisal practices that result in redlining, but we also have things like municipal underbounding, where cities opt not to incorporate poor and minority areas so that they don't have to extend services to them. We see a lot of this in the Houston area, as well as in a lot of other more rural areas. I'm also particularly concerned about the diversion of capital investment away from poor neighborhoods. We see in Houston that the majority of Black and brown neighborhoods in the city still have open ditches as opposed to piped stormwater management systems. And that, I believe, also exacerbates flooding. And then, of course, we don't generally provide enough affordable housing in our communities. And so the consequences are some of those disparities I mentioned, but ultimately, it's this greater exposure to natural disasters like flooding, as well as the spread of disease and the exposure to pollution. There's a lot on this slide. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I think you guys are all familiar with these kinds of dynamics. So when we see great flooding events like we saw in Harvey, we see that the damage, while it does still happen in more affluent and white areas, that we're seeing it primarily concentrated in lower income areas and in areas that are majority Black and Hispanic in the city of Houston. These are just some maps that show you kind of where the damage occurred. And if you think back to that first slide that I showed you, you can also kind of see how it's structured along the watershed and the bayou system that runs through Harris County. So we do see that those development patterns result in increased exposure and physical vulnerability. So I'm going to kind of stop there, but there's some takeaways in terms of just recognizing that our poor and minority communities are going to be disproportionately affected, and trying to take the opportunity to prioritize them in the recovery period so that those inequities are not exacerbated. And I'm going to stop there and turn it over to two of my colleagues who have some great stories to tell you, and where they're doing work in some of these communities and kind of what's working to help us diminish social vulnerability and help these communities continue to thrive.
But before that, let's take a couple polls.
Oh, right. We do have the polling questions. Sorry. So yeah, go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
I went ahead and absolutely. I went ahead and just launched the first poll, and the question is: has your community experienced a climate change related disaster like flood, unusual freeze, drought, fire, tornado in the past 5 years? We'll give it a few moments here, and then we'll share those results to see who we have on the line. Another second. Okay.
Yeah, we see heavily that, yeah, that you guys are here because you're having these issues.
Right. All right. And then, so yeah, 68% yes, 23% no, and 8% unsure. So now I'm gonna head into our second polling question here. I'm launching that. Is your community undertaking any planning efforts to adapt to climate change or to mitigate negative impacts? Because, well, it's happening. There we go. I just shared those results. So 63% yes, we are undertaking planning efforts. 18% no, 19% unsure.
I was going to say that's encouraging a little bit.
Okay, so I think it's my turn, so I'll hop in and give you some examples from some of the work we've been doing in Texas. So I'm director of Texas Target Communities. We work with low capacity communities across the state and we assist them with different planning needs. And typically we're focusing on those who are vulnerable to disasters. I am also author of Planning for Community Resilience, and I'm going to be sharing with you today some of our work we've done with funding from the Department of Homeland Security through the Coastal Resilience Center, which is a center of excellence at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So I just wanted to bring this up. I don't know if you've seen it. There's this great sort of 2-page document. It's pretty short, coming out of APA, the 5 strategic points of intervention. It just outlines, you know, the ways in which planners influence or impact their community. We all are doing this in our jobs on a regular basis, from visioning to plan making through standards and policies, also development work and public investments. I'm a big believer in not reinventing the wheel and not working harder but smarter. So I bring this slide up and this document up because I really feel like the work of thinking about hazard mitigation and equity can all be folded into the current work that you're already doing. I think resilience plans are great. I think plans focus on equity are great, but for communities that are, you know, spread thin, you can do these things in your everyday work. You just need someone to have it on their minds, and it can be folded into your existing activities. So I'm going to show you some of that today. So the first kind of way to be thinking about it is obviously through your plan making process. And a lot of what we do with Texas Target Communities is focus on that plan making process and making sure it is inclusive. We are bringing all different voices to the table, that there is a specific methodology that we can use to engage different types of voices. So that way we can hear the full range of issues. I like this slide. This drawing was actually a drawing that occurred while myself and some community partners were talking on a panel just about some of the things we were saying. So they were live kind of drawing the things we were saying. But what I like about this is having issues or discussions around climate and climate impacts. We had different folks at the table in a rural community. And the things we were hearing, you know, it was not the how is this happening? Why is this happening? Who's to blame for this happening? But, you know, at the end of the day, everyone could agree on we all want a healthy quality of life. And so starting with that foundation of, you know, we're all really in it together. helps to move a conversation forward when you're having these tougher conversations around climate change or around equity. And I really feel that planners can bring those different voices to the table. They can be conveners in this space. So first off, getting at what I'm saying, I guess, is if you're not at the table, oftentimes then you're on the menu. And I think a lot of times as it happens intentionally, but also a lot of the time is unintentional consequences of not hearing voices and perspectives and viewpoints. And so as a foundation for what you're doing when you're thinking about equity and when you're thinking about climate impacts, I feel like it's always going to start with the conversations you're having with different folks, the different communities within your community. And people are, once they are provisioned with the knowledge and skills and encouragement, they really can make the most informed decisions about their community. And I think it can happen from the ground up. How it's done is, there's lots of literature out there. What I'm saying is not anything new or revolutionary. But it's all about forming a great team, whether it's your planning committee, whether you call it a task force, or whether you have it as some sort of other teaming effort or working group. It really needs to be a good mix of different types of people. And I really like this diagram because it changes the conversation or the tone of how we want to arrange the dynamics of our working groups. Sure, you're going to have the movers and shakers involved in your plan making and your planning efforts. They're the ones with the assets. They may own land and property and businesses in the community. And we want them to participate, especially we want them willing and active. But we want to get out and work with those who are moved and shaken and those who have been intentionally or unintentionally left out of conversations. They're what Shannon's been talking about in terms of social vulnerability. They're underemployed, unemployed. Oftentimes they're blue collar workers, and bringing them to the table. They've been disconnected for a variety of different reasons. But we want those who are disconnected and still willing to participate. And the way we do that is really focusing on this middle third group who can bridge the gap between the movers and shakers and the moved and shaken and are trusted by both sides. And oftentimes we're looking for people who maybe, depending on the community, they may be pastors, they may be the leaders of mission-oriented organizations, they may be school staff. In one of our communities, it was the lady at the register at the Dairy Queen. So it just really depends on the community. But thinking in this way, when you are having these kinds of conversations, we're thinking about these issues, making sure your group represents the various communities within the community. This is how we're thinking about it and doing it. The second piece I want to kind of bring up before I talk about the project is if you're not thinking about your risk, and this isn't a common saying like the other one, but if you're not thinking about your risk, then you might actually be exacerbating your risk unintentionally. Again, not intentionally, right? But unintentionally, you might be doing that. And there's so many different aspects to thinking about disasters. And we know our emergency managers are working hard on preparing for it, the response itself, and recovery efforts as well. But we as planners need to be folding mitigation into our planning efforts that we are doing. And so I'm going to share the work that we've been doing with one of our communities. Before I do that, though, this project through the Coastal Resilience Center at UNC, we've been working for the last 8 years on a tool called the Plan Integration for a Resilience Scorecard. It is now available as a training on APA Learn for free. It's going to be available for a limited time for free, so you can take advantage of it now. But essentially what this tool does is we look at the existing plans that we have in our community, and we're looking at the policies within those plans, and we're seeing if those policies are conflicting with one another. And not just conflicting with one another, but are they conflicting in a particular place, in a particular neighborhood? This is important because we can overlay what Shannon was talking about in terms of social vulnerability with the policies that we have in our network of plans, the plans we have that are already on the books. And we can see how those policies might be impacting particular neighborhoods. We worked closely with the city of Norfolk a number of years ago to test this tool. And what we realized, and Norfolk has been doing some really great and innovative things around resilience. We realized that they scored relatively well, and that was to be expected because they've been working and thinking about resilience. But when we overlaid the scores of their plans with social vulnerability, we realized that there were fewer policies overall focused on the socially vulnerable neighborhoods, and fewer policies around flood mitigation. And knowing Norfolk's exposure, they have sea level rise that's going to be significant over the next 80 years and beyond. And so there's a lot to think about. And it was sort of like this aha moment, or sort of like, wow, we had no idea. We've been working so hard on thinking about this, but we didn't even realize that there were, we weren't thinking as intentionally about these particular areas. So with that data and with that information, they went after a HUD grant and have been working to, and they've secured funding to develop a park specifically to help mitigate some of the floodwaters that are projected for that area. So I'm going to quickly go through my example from Rockport. I know Shannon mentioned it, so it was the ground zero, where Hurricane Harvey made landfall along the Texas coast before it moved on to Houston. This community is about 11,000 in population, so it's small, it's tiny, it's rural. So we wanted to test to see how we could use plans as data to actually mitigate risks in the community. Can we use existing tools like the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard and other plan quality tools to see how we can reduce the risk, and particularly in vulnerable areas? And we just published a paper about this, which you can see there, and I'm happy to share as well. But just for a little context, this small rural community is about 30% minority population of Hispanic primarily, and also there's a Vietnamese fishing community. 20% of the population moved away essentially after the hurricane, and they had a 15% reduction in their student enrollment. Their big public facilities were damaged as well. Something to know about this community is a tourist community. So there's sort of this dichotomy of those who are taking advantage of the assets of a tourism economy, who are higher wealth, and then those who are in the service industry serving and supporting those, and so who are in lower income communities. This particular community had affordable housing issues, and essentially the way in which folks were able to live affordably was in RV parks. So the affordable housing that's going on there right now is essentially RVs. And that is, after Hurricane Harvey, it's just gotten worse. But they decided 1 year after the hurricane to launch a comprehensive planning effort. They had been meaning to do this for many years, and they thought, this may be an opportunity for us to all come together as a community and decide how we wanted to recover and rebuild. So we worked closely with them, designing an engagement process, working to hear from different voices across the community. And what we heard was, probably very similar themes that your community might hear, but they really did want to focus on the fact that they wanted to be, they were culturally diverse, and they wanted to embrace that, and they wanted to be economically vibrant, and they wanted to focus on their arts community and the charm of their coast. They really, these guiding principles on the right, the top one really focused on being an inclusive community. So not having the sort of haves and the have-nots in their community just separated, but how can we come together and there be a stronger sense of community. Additionally, the last guiding principle on the right there, coastal charm, they really did want to focus on promoting conservation to reduce disaster impacts. And you'll just notice, if you notice the themes of the boards on the bottom left, where I come from, an oceanfront property, we really had fun with the engagement process because George Strait actually lives in Rockport, has been going there for many, many years now. And so at the end of the day, everyone's Texan, and everyone appreciated the music and charm of that. So we had fun and got a lot of folks involved in the process. But in terms of how we can use the plans as data, essentially what we did was, based on the community feedback, we heard what it is that we wanted to focus on and prioritize, and a first draft was developed. We used that first draft and we inputted it into the Sustaining Places Plan Quality Assessment tool, the PAS Report 567, if you've seen that. That is a tool that APA has as a resource, and we decided we wanted to see what the plan quality of that comprehensive plan draft was. Then we made improvements based on what we learned from that assessment. We took the second draft and we did the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard assessment to see how that plan and the network of plans in the community was impacting hazard impacts. And then we revised that draft, and hopefully we were wanting to move the ball, get the community into the highest possible quality plan and integrate it across the network of plans as a way to reduce hazard impacts. So the two tools, and I don't have to go into too many details, but the Sustaining Places tool from APA is kind of identified or displayed here in green, and the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard is in the blue. And they have very different purposes, right? We're looking at the Sustaining Places in the green. We're just looking at one plan. We're really looking at the policies and the processes that happen within it. They do talk about the importance of integrating the plan and coordinating across the network of plans, but we're looking at the range of different best practices that our planning profession says. And then in the blue, the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard, it's not just looking at the comprehensive plan, but it's looking at all the different plans. And specifically, we really want to look at the policies or the action items within the number of different plans you might have. And when we look at each action item or each policy, what we are looking for is there a policy tool, something that's implementable? Is it spatial? So is there a space specific term that's within there? So we can say, yeah, they're talking about this neighborhood or this downtown district. And finally, we're looking, are they actually talking about the specific theme or outcome that we're looking for? So are they talking about resilience? Is it going to impact resilience? Are they talking about equity? Does it impact equity? So on and so forth. So when we did we looked at the first draft and we took the Sustaining Places tool. We looked at the plan quality. We noticed a number of deficits. So in terms of infrastructure development and equity, we noticed a variety of different things. They weren't really talking about multimodal networks. We really weren't talking about green infrastructure, and there wasn't really strong or precise language around it if we were. The plan also could have been stronger in the discussions around post-disaster recovery and mitigation strategies. It wasn't as specific as it could have been. There were discussions of upgrading infrastructure facilities, but it wasn't really reflected in the action items specifically. It was just more general language about the need and goals to do that. And there wasn't any discussion of climate change adaptation, as well as, even though this was right after Hurricane Harvey, there wasn't specific language in there about floodplain management and the ways to reduce that. So that was really powerful information that we then took and updated that draft. So we inputted that plan into that assessment. We got some results out of it so we could improve the comprehensive plan. Once we took that second draft, we then inputted the second draft, and we looked at the network of plans to do the plan integration for Resilience Scorecard. So there were 5 other plans we were looking at. They have hazard mitigation plan, of course. There was a floodplain management plan. They had a long-term recovery plan they had just developed after Hurricane Harvey. And there was also a couple of different downtown heritage district plans that we reviewed. And what we found was, yes, they scored relatively well. And these maps are kind of showing a visual of how they were each plan was scoring. And the thing that you will want to kind of notice, I guess, is the areas in pink were the ones that had policies that were in conflict or exacerbating hazard impacts. So, what we noticed was there was, policies related to improvements to the downtown, right? We wanted to bring businesses back. We wanted to create these developer-ready zones, but they were in hazard-prone areas, and they were not giving specific language at all to how they were going to mitigate those disasters or hazards by elevating or any other sort of strategy. So that was happening in their heritage district plan. That was happening even in their long-term recovery plan. While at the same time, their hazard mitigation plan in those same areas were saying we should do buyouts. We should update our zoning regulations. And all of those things are good, but clearly there is not a coordination across the different departments and agencies and across the different plans. And how can we more efficiently coordinate our efforts and coordinate the planning strategies as well? So knowing that information, that was a second set of data. The plan was then updated. The plan, these are sort of excerpts from that plan. One was, or what you can see are the reference to other plans within the community. So we wanted to specifically say, no, this recommendation and this strategy is coming from the hazard mitigation plan, and this one's coming from the long-term recovery plan. At the end of the plan, there is an implementation table, and there's a specific plan integration column that also kind of highlights, which action item and which policy is referring to which plan. And this really helped as there's turnover and the political will might change in the community. It really helps kind of emphasize the importance of each of those action items. So through this process, we really saw that we could take an unbiased approach using the data coming from the plans and move the ball forward in terms of creating better plan quality, as well as plan integration across the network of plans as a way to reduce hazard impacts. And we saw a number of different additional initiatives emerge around green infrastructure, around avoiding new development in flood-prone areas, improved regional coordination, as well as making sure that existing infrastructure is and the neighborhoods that are supported by the existing infrastructure is maintained, and reduced impact around those. And there were a number of different outcomes. The fact that this plan was the first ever for them to have sort of a resilience-centered policy framework. The idea that we could have innovation in implementation to bring it back to, no, this is a coordinated effort amongst many departments and agencies, and we're working together every time we implement one of our action items or policies within the plan. There was actually 73 best practice policies that were adopted across the network. So there were great things happening in these other plans that we then were able to fold into the final draft of the comprehensive plan. And there were 48 different implementation actions that were referencing other plans as well. And then it also received the Silver Achievement Award from the Texas chapter of the American Planning Association. So I hope this gives you some food for thought as you think about resilience and equity in your communities. And I will pass it over.
Hi, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Yeah. All right. Thanks for the opportunity to join you today. I am Tisha Holmes. I'm an assistant professor at Florida State University in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. I study what communities are doing, particularly in under-resourced contexts, to respond to climate change in coastal areas, in more rural contexts in Florida and the Caribbean primarily. So today what I'm going to present is like a sliver of a broader ongoing collaborative project that I'm working on with some collaborators at Florida State as well as University of Illinois in Chicago, that's looking at the dynamics of potential displacement related to sea level rise in Miami-Dade, Jacksonville, and the Tampa Bay region. And this research was funded by the Leroy Collins Institute at Florida State and the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy. So I'm just going to present the community advocate perspective on addressing climate gentrification. Now, just to sort of set up the discussion, a little background on Florida. Florida is the third most populous state with the second longest coastline. Our economy is highly dependent on the three S's, the sun, the sand, and the sea tourism. And that's closely linked to high investment and real estate development, particularly in growing gateway cities like Tampa and Miami. And sea level rise is an enormous threat, which will really reshape how development looks in Florida, but also affects existing development and infrastructure and economic activity. And a likely scenario for Florida in terms of sea level rise that we're going to see maybe a 1 meter of sea level rise. I think that's a conservative estimate because we're already beginning to see the impacts of that related to sunny day flooding, enhanced storm surge, and coastal erosion. So the potential for displacement really calls into question issues around equity and justice, because those who could most likely be displaced broadly, but often lack the adaptive capacity to address the threats themselves, often reside in lower income, under-resourced, underserved areas. So in the case of Florida, where the most wealthy oftentimes live on the coast, some, if not many, of the displaced residents in Florida are wealthier, who may move inland. This is a different story here. Who may move inland from those higher, cost coastal properties. They have the potential to seek out higher ground, lower value neighborhoods to settle in, to improve it, and then potentially gentrify. So in the context of this setup, we're asking, this research project is asking the question, in the face of an impending exodus from the coast, how can those receiving communities that are on higher ground prepare while protecting the residents that are already there? So we were really trying to bring a more empirical lens around the topic of climate gentrification and hopefully uncover those nuances. What are the drivers? What are the local factors that are at play here? So the main question we're trying to answer is, how are communities responding to the potential for future displacement from the high cost coastal properties and the pressure of increasing displacement risk in higher elevation, but often lower cost properties further inland. So we wanted to identify essentially which groups are more likely to be displaced from the coast due to sea level rise, and what are those strategies and policies that are in place to reduce that risk. But we also want to understand which are the higher elevation communities that could potentially become receiving communities, and those that could potentially undergo neighborhood change because of that migration. And are there any policies in place to reduce displacement there? And we try to understand that through 3 strategies: mapping, a policy analysis and plan analysis, as well as interviews with resilience housing planners and community advocates. So I'm going to present the results from the interviews today. But the broader overall story, based on what we found, is that we're seeing essentially a doubling down on development on the coast here in Florida. And there's a lot of building and densification that's still happening in all 3 of the cases. And even though there's a lot of migration into Florida, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of migration away from the coast of Florida. And on the planning side, the planners are really trying to employ a protection as well as accommodation approach, where they're using structural adaptations, enhancing the building codes, using nature-based strategies. They're making those as clear priorities to sort of push back the reality of coastal displacement further into the future. So really, climate gentrification may be a hot topic in the media, but sort of the idea of retreat and displacement really isn't a prominent concern, because the land values are too high. And the protection, sort of like leaving that land is not really worth it at this point. So there's much more of an orientation to maintain the status quo as much as possible. Then we have some other dynamics that are happening in terms of the land developers. The land developers, unlike the planners, are really operating on a different time scale. They're operating into the 1 to 2 business cycle time frame, right? They're talking about developing on higher ground because it's higher elevation, and that's going to avoid the coastal flooding issue. And they're essentially quietly consolidating those properties, but they're still sort of enhancing development in very vulnerable areas. Then at the local level within each case, we find some variations. In Miami, we see that they're very aware of the risks and connections, but they're also unsure about where that exact tipping point is for action that's going to be salient enough to trigger a movement away from the coast and then have those cascading impacts inland. In Panelists, in the Tampa Bay region, they are in the let's figure out what we have in terms of our planning intelligence. They are studying various elements, the vulnerability assessments, their housing stocks. They're developing essentially a strong information base to eventually inform action. And then in Jacksonville, there's definitely action on the ground from the community side to sound the alarm, to pay attention to what's happening, but without a whole lot of connection and collaboration with the government. So just going to briefly show you what we mapped here. This is a map of the 3 areas. Duval County is in the top right, Tampa Bay is in the bottom left, and Miami is in the bottom right. So we're essentially mapping here the idea of first order displacement, characterizing by different populations, who's going to leave the coastline. And we can see that it's primarily happening on the coast with the exception of the Jacksonville area, because that's also happening along the large St. Johns River. So these are our areas that we've identified that could potentially move inland. Now this shows where might people actually go. Not will they, but where might they go? The areas that are in red are those that are most at risk in terms of displacement. Orange is moderate risk, and then yellow is low risk of displacement. And you can see there's the hashed boxes are indicating areas that have already been identified as community redevelopment districts or O-zones. So in the Miami area, there are like well-known areas like Overtown, Little Haiti, Liberty City, and Alapata that all already fall within these areas that are ripe for new investment. So the inland story is that gentrification is underway, but there are a bunch of different drivers that are happening to increase development pressure without necessarily this change in what's going on at the coast or migration from the coast, but there's also very little political incentive to ameliorate it right now. Real estate speculation continues to go on. Developers are seeking higher ground as well. One interviewee sort of indicated in a kind of more nefarious way, but these outfalls of this new speculation isn't really benefiting the existing residents inland. So while there is action happening from the resilience side, as well as the climate planning side, trying to understand what those vulnerabilities are and the risks are and developing the strategies, because retreat and displacement discussions aren't as prominent, we're trying to offer the scenario that although this may not be happening at a large scale right now, it's coming, and planners need to start thinking really strategically about this, what that means for the communities on the coast and what that also means for the communities inland, because if we wait, it's definitely going to be too late. So there's been a call from community advocacy organizations like United Way Suncoast for planners to start thinking creatively when they're negotiating and making these decisions with developers and the private sector, when they're building housing, that it should be more affordable, that we have to repair the existing housing stock and find other opportunities to create new avenues for affordable housing and preserve the affordable housing that's there. And that could include using double density provisions, using surplus land that the city or the county owns in order to keep the inland communities, residents in inland communities in place. One of the interesting sort of collaborations that came up in the research, through the research that I kind of want to highlight that kind of gets at the planners trying to respond and think about this in an integrated way is the Resiliency and Energy Assessment of Communities and Housing program. It's essentially a collaboration in Tampa Bay, which is much more focused on increasing the availability of resilient housing, partnered with doing climate vulnerability assessments, doing housing stock assessments, doing policy reviews. So it's very much an orientation to create a platform or an opportunity or a space to have an integrated approach. Another interesting approach from the community side is what Catalyst Miami is doing down in Miami, in the Miami-Dade area. Catalyst Miami is a very highly mobilized, high capacity community organization, and they have a number of anti-displacement programs that they're developing. So CLEAR, the North Miami Community Investment Corporation is one of them that essentially models community level economics to promote more equitable and collective wealth. In the neighborhood, residents essentially own commercial real estate. Catalyst Miami oversees the purchase of the land or the real estate and then sells it back to the community members to increase ownership and investment and wealth within their constituency. They also have CLEAR, which is a community leadership on environment and advocacy resilience program, as well as HEAL, the Housing Equity Advocacy and Leadership Program. These are people-based approaches, right, of nurturing and mentoring homegrown leaders and innovators, homegrown wealth at the intersection of climate, justice, and housing. And really tying in capacity, providing funding to move it from ideas or plans into something that's implemented as a project. Another playmaker up in Jacksonville is Groundwork Jax. They were specifically formulated as a local community-based planning and implementation partner. The city is focusing on a watershed restoration for the St. Johns River, and Groundworks is essentially that vehicle or organization to engage neighborhood stakeholders, business leaders, funders, and the city to build, to plan and build the Emerald Trail, which we have a map of here, by 2029. Now, this idea around the Emerald Trail, it is, sort of nature-based green infrastructure, places that improve a healthy lifestyle, but it's also an economic development catalyst. The trail is going to encompass about 30 miles of trails and greenways and parks that's going to circle the urban core of neighborhoods that, are predominantly historic neighborhoods, downtown, African-American neighborhoods, lower income neighborhoods. as well as connecting to the different creeks like Hogan Creek, McCoy Creek, and St. John's River. So it really has a potential to be not only an environmental amenity, but to also enhance the social and economic development of the area and promote neighborhood revitalization in an equitable way while reducing the risk related to flooding and increasing climate resilience. Now I'm going to just share a few quotes. I'm not going to read all of them, but just to orient you to what some themes are that were sort of common across the cases. All of our interviewees essentially highlighted that there's a stark and just ongoing lack of protections for the preservation and construction of affordable housing, right? So beyond the climate discussion, right here on top is the affordable housing gap. And the reality that the growth machine in Florida is not slowing down, and it's incentivized by a permissive landscape. So while gentrification really seems to be inevitable, if not purposeful, there are ways that you can arrest the potential for displacement for those that are already living in these sort of at-risk communities inland without even climate change having to be an accelerating factor. Another interesting theme is the dualities and the tensions of balancing what risks you're dealing with right now with what the future risks and priorities should be. So one aspect is that the city and the county processes really aren't doing enough right now to address and meet the intensity and urgency of the problem of what's to come. And another element on the other side of that is the struggle of focusing, just community organizations as well as city agencies and planners to focus on what the immediate needs are right now while attending to the future impact and how to balance those two things in tandem. So you continue to see the perpetuation of reactive planning as opposed to proactive planning approaches that can both respond and then also anticipate the problems that are coming. And then relatedly, it's really just difficult, to respond in a more proactive way because the problem of climate change, sea level rise, affordability, the insurance crisis, it's just a very interrelated, complex set of pressures. And a lot of times the dynamics are often unseen or very slow. So whether it's a domino effect situation or there are a bunch of unintended consequences from decisions that are made now that are then accelerated by sea level rise, or that the environment just sort of creates a setup to have a very sort of negative, maladaptive outcome. And we still haven't adjusted, we as planners still haven't adjusted the way that we solve complex, wicked problems, right? We sort of continue to apply a more reductive lens to problematize things and design solutions that aren't necessarily as integrated as it can be. And then finally, a couple more slides here. Just a commonality across the interviews was that the community organizations were very intentional and elevating the focus on the idea of equity-centered planning, and the expansion of community capacity to integrate, to do integrated programming and project implementation. So these advocacy organizations are really guided by these values. They're stepping up when there's a void in leadership left by agencies who, to be fair, understand the value of community-based equity planning or approach in producing more sustainable outcomes, more productive outcomes, but they're essentially lagging behind, not moving fast enough for the problem that we're facing, or really having difficulty even scaling to the community level and across communities. So these groups are thinking about the ways to move the needle in nimble ways, in ways that can be scaled up, that's replicable, and may not necessarily even require city agencies or planners or sort of government decision makers to co-sign, right, to get started, in order to embed that idea of self-sufficiency into the neighborhood system, within the community system. So unlike agencies who are much bigger and more inflexible, specialized and siloed, the advocacy organizations are approaching this and are able to approach it in a more strategic, integrated, systems levels way to tackle those multiple connected pressures. It's not just about housing. It's also about economic security. It's also about health. It's also about environmental sustainability. They're all sort of interconnected in their program design. So it's a much more human design oriented approach. So these organizations and others like them are really working to call attention to the climate equity issues in their respective regions and really push the public sector to develop more robust responses that go beyond just the plan. They're working to identify community needs. They're doing visioning activities. They're developing plans. They're building capacity to implement the programs and the projects in these neighborhoods, but there are a number of gaps that remain, right? There's an implementation gap where the policies are on the books, but they're not doing enough and they're not being implemented. There's a housing gap. There's just a gross lack of affordable housing in these communities that needs to be filled. And sort of constructing 100 houses is not going to even meet the level that's required to reduce housing inequities and pressures. There's an equity gap. The displacement of communities of color increasing and lower income workers are oftentimes on tenuous ground. And we don't really, the window is closing now. We don't have a whole lot of time to ameliorate that. And then the integration gap, which the community organizations brought up over and over again, is that we need to bring together the resilience discussion, the resilience planners, actors, decision makers, with the housing planners, actors, and decision makers, because in both realms, we've been doing a lot of good work, but these problems require us to talk across and with each other. So now I'm going to hand it back over to Christine for the Q&A session.
Wonderful. And again, folks, please feel free to type your questions into our Q&A box, and we'll see what we can all get accomplished here. And Tisha, since you closed up and you're fresh on the mind, we'll start with you. How about that?
Sounds
so
good.
What's the next phase of research? What's next?
Yeah, great question. So it is still an evolving research project. So far, we've done the mapping as well as the plan analysis and some interviews. And we have that story around what's going on from the public sector perspective, the community perspective. But what's really important is to get the private sector perspective. We'd like to at least do some interviews with developers that are working in these areas, as well as maybe insurance or people in the insurance industry, because those are some really important dynamics that come into play on how the decisions play out. So if we can expand that, it's not an easy group to access, but we hope to sort of get out there and talk with people who are willing to speak with us.
Okay, great. So let's start. Oh, let's see. Who should we go to next? Let's start with you. Let's go back to you, Shannon. To what extent, and everyone can answer this too, so please, everyone, please chime in. To what extent do post-disaster recovery planning include returning transit-dependent people back to their home communities? So the person who's asking the question is, I'm thinking of post-Katrina, where people got stuck for months, literally wherever they were evacuated to, and sometimes they didn't even know where they were getting evacuated to. They might not even have family or friends wherever they were evacuated to, with no mechanism to provide them transportation back home.
Right. Well, it's a great question, and it's a question I get a lot. I remember even after Katrina, people asking me if I thought that we should be rebuilding New Orleans, and I mean, to be honest, I felt like that was kind of a silly question, because of course we're going to rebuild New Orleans. I mean, a lot of cities are located on the coast for very good reasons, as everyone knows. I mean, New Orleans is a major port, just like Houston is and Jacksonville is, and there are reasons that we live along the coast. And yes, it provides risk to us, but those reasons still continue to exist. And post-disaster recovery planning absolutely should be considering where people are being relocated, and if they're, I don't want to say allowed to return, because I work with a lot of housing advocates as well, and we don't want to take people away from their cultural communities. We do want to give them options. So I think people should have the option of relocating, and they should also understand the risk associated with not relocating. If they go back to their original communities, which we see a lot of that happening in communities that flood over and over again, they need to understand the risk, and they need to be given tools by which to make themselves safer, whether it's elevating their homes, or whatever, in strengthening building codes and things like that. So, but that definitely is a part of post-disaster recovery. And it's, in my opinion, it's best addressed before the disaster rather than after. And one of the things that we're big proponents of is pre-disaster recovery planning, or pre-covery, as we'd like to call it. Because in places like Texas and Florida, where we're, flooding is a way of life. It's not a disaster that it's going to be 20 or 30 or 50 years before the next one. It's something that many of our communities are dealing with year in and year out. And we can't pretend that it's, some unpredictable thing. It's very predictable. And so we do need to be taking these opportunities to have places for people to go that are appropriate and are going to allow them to continue their economic livelihood, that are going to keep their communities together. We need to, but I think a lot of what we've heard, both from Jaimie and from Tisha, are that we have to talk with those communities about what is best for them, and not necessarily assume that we know what is best for them. I'll leave it at that.
And I have to tell you, I'm a big documentary person, and I remember watching a documentary about Katrina, actually in the last year or so. And I want to say it was on Netflix, and I think it's called, because I just looked it up, The Refuge of Last Resort. Maybe that's what it was. And it was just a story about a family who couldn't afford to leave the area in order to get out. And they just recorded their time there, and then recorded what happened to them and where they ended up, and about all the Katrina babies and all of this crazy stuff regarding, how do I get back when they displaced me to another state, So anyways,
yeah,
it's totally worth a gander if you can.
And I just, in Rockport, all of their apartments, the rental apartment, the multifamily housing was impacted. And so, not including, whatever other rental housing issues there were. So I think you also have to think about that, as well as if someone is a homeowner. Another issue they were having was the substantial damage rule, right? So many people weren't able to return because their home had been substantially damaged, or more than 50% of the structure had been damaged. The value of the structure was damaged. So they had to either buy it out, which takes many, many, many years, or they had to raise it, and they weren't financially able to do that. And so it was, it creates, well, do we even want to return? There's nothing to return to. Where do I live? Is what folks in Rockport were dealing with.
And Jaimie, since we have you, we got a question here. Let's start with you for this one. During the plan review work in the communities you investigated, did you find action items that were very aspirational, or that were not well defined or doable? And how did your team interact with the plan owners about these types of issues if they were discovered?
Yeah, that is very, very common. Even in some plans, that our planning staff are developing, you'll just see very aspirational policies or action items. And when you see them in other plans, the long-term recovery plan, sometimes in the hazard mitigation plans, there's not very specific language. So when we're doing I encourage folks to do the plan integration for resilient scorecard process, because you then pull together the different sort of owners of those plans, the different departments. So we had the emergency manager there, we had folks that were leading the long-term recovery plan, and you're having those discussions, and they're sort of realizing, oh yeah, what were we meaning by this? How are we actually going to implement this? Is this even doable? And it allows us to get a little bit more fine grain of what policy tool can we put to this, and how can we get it done? So through that process, typically, and especially in Norfolk, they had the same issue. We were going back, and basically they were changing the policies, amending them, and amending the plans themselves to make sure that they were more specific. And other sort of issues were coming about in realizing, we were thinking about, for instance, siting our community facilities near transit centers, but we didn't think about siting our community facilities, in and out of a floodplain. And so, there was lots of conversations. And so there was a need to update the policies and amend them throughout the plans.
Great, thank you. This is a good question, and it kind of leads into a larger discussion. And I think we'll start with Shannon, and then if anyone else has any comments to add, we can. Have you dealt with communities where the petrochemical industry is a major employer? And if so, how have your efforts been received? And the question goes on to say, I work in Western North Dakota, and we have seen unusual weather events this winter and wildfire events in the summer. I think it'd be hard sell to bring forward measures to address climate change. And so I say this is sort of like a conduit to a larger question of addressing climate change and sort of knowing your audience when you're addressing climate change and how to address climate change to your particular audience.
Well, Jaimie may want to weigh in on this one too, because we certainly do have a number of petrochemical industries along the Texas Gulf Coast, and in fact, a lot of the communities that were impacted by Hurricane Harvey, a lot of their workforce is at the refineries and that sort of thing, and so yeah, it's not the most popular term. Climate change is not. We don't really talk about it in those terms that much. I think is the key is. We're in a position, and I think North Dakota probably is too, that you've had enough floods that you can talk about what's actually happening instead of why it's happening. I mean, while ultimately we need to be able to talk about the change that is coming, we're still facing the change that has already come, in the sense that we have these floods happening year after year, and we can't deny the fact that the floods are more frequent and worse than at least in our recent memory, in our historical memory. And plus, I think, as Jaimie mentioned, the petrochemical industries are really, they need that workforce to come back. And so that we're seeing in a lot of these coastal communities that with the loss of affordable housing, that the workforce can't return. Even, and it's not as much with petrochemical, but certainly with the tourism industry. But those two things are linked along the Texas coast. It's all tied together. We can't extricate it. And so to have the workforce housing return and to be able to restore the economies, the petrochemical companies need to talk about that too, and they're willing to. I think we also are finding in Texas that the petrochemical companies are recognizing that they're having to make changes in their own industry as well. They're looking for more sustainable energy sources. We have a lot of wind and solar in Texas as well. That doesn't mean that we're not still using the petrochemical industry, but just that they're going to have to diversify as well. And they're interested in how they can do that. Jaimie, do you want to add? Because you probably have more specific examples.
And I mean, it's different if we're talking about a community that, where the workforce is dependent on that industry. And so a lot of, the conversation changes. We're not, they need those jobs. So we're not having conversations about, why climate change is happening. It's what can we do and be more action oriented about the actual impacts. The other type of community that we've worked with, though, are those who are like fence line communities who are getting the direct impacts from the petrochemical, the air quality issues, but also, in Hurricane Harvey, researchers were taking data that were, the chemicals from those facilities flooding into those neighborhoods that were just adjacent to those facilities. And so that has a whole other conversations, which, there's not any sort of easy answers. And in and around Houston, the community we were working with, it was a city within, and in our Houston sort of surrounded this island city, I guess. and adjacent to them was the petrochemical facilities. And those facilities they're not on city land. They're on City of Houston Port Authority land. So the political dynamics are really complicated, and it's hard to, when a city is only 20,000 in population, surrounded by petrochemical facilities, how much say does it really have? And I don't think there's any easy answers, but I would focus on the common ground, like mentioned before, that how can we all move forward in a productive way so that we can all of us can minimize the risk, and we can have a healthy quality of life.
So we're seeing a lot of our agricultural lands being redeveloped, and those that remain have seen a large uptick in localized flooding of their property. So the question says, I'm just curious if there have been any farming communities that any of you have spoken to that have expressed this type of concern in your outreach and research, and if you think there's a parallel between this and your work.
Could you say the first part again, the agriculture?
Yeah, it says we're seeing a lot of our agricultural lands being redeveloped, and those that remain, so like those farms that are remaining, have seen a large uptick in localized flooding on their property.
Jaimie. I mean, I can start by saying, at least, a lot of the flooding that we saw in Hurricane Harvey was attributed to the development of the Katy Prairie, which is an area that's out west of the city of Houston. And I remember, I'm old, when I was younger in the 80s and 90s, driving from Houston to San Antonio, it was full of rice fields and a lot of other agricultural uses that were part of, utilize that marshland that was there. And now all of that area is housing. It's been paved over and it's housing. And so it has not only reduced the ability of the land to absorb the water, but it's also increased the impervious surface. So it's like a double whammy with this rapid growth around the city of Houston, and Houston is not at all unique in that regard. So yes, we definitely see that happening. I mean, I hear planners say that they have these zero runoff requirements, but I frankly don't believe it. and I don't understand. I know that there's efforts to make sure that there's not increased runoff, but I don't think it's very effective. So we do, yes, the short answer is yes. I think we are aware of those concerns, and I don't see that planners have very good responses to it, at least in our area.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say for them to take a really close look at the subdivision regulations. We're seeing that, though, across Texas. I mean, there's so much of the development is encroaching into agricultural areas. And I think this is also a good place to be able to bring the different voices to the table. We had one example northeast of Houston. The third loop around Houston is going through this community, this ag community. And the locals knew, they were like, that area floods. And it didn't really matter. The developer came and developed the land, and while it wasn't on the FEMA flood map, the locals did say that used to be a rice field and it's going to flood, and the folks who were then on the hook were those who are now living there. So I think it's a really good question, but I think there's a opportunity to have those conversations early and often with residents and those who know locally.
And I think that's a good opportunity, depending on your political dynamics, but certainly in Texas, the agricultural landowners have a lot of political influence in our state legislature, much more than, the population of those areas would probably warrant. And so that may be an opportunity. Sometimes it's like strange bedfellows where you you find yourself, it's like along the coast, the coastal conservation, the anglers, the fishermen are also the ones that want to protect the coast. And so politically, they may not, they may not agree on a lot else, but they can agree on that. And I think the same may be true with large agricultural landholders, that they have more political power and they can engage in that conversation in ways that maybe we struggle to do otherwise.
Okay, thank you. Tisha, what role is UIC playing in your project, and could you explain a little bit more about UIC?
Sure. So University of Illinois, Chicago is where one of my collaborator resides right now. She used to be at Florida State, but then took another position at UIC. But the idea for the team is that we have a researcher who sort of does more community-based climate work. April Jackson, who is at UIC, is much more of a housing expert. And Will Butler is also an environmental planner, does a lot of work on sea level rise, but from a perspective of collaborative governance and regional governance. So again, we're asking questions that are complicated and difficult, which require also a complicated or integrated research team. So it brings together different understandings, different methods, different perspectives, to really unpack the different layers that are in this thick question.
I think we have time for one more. All right, Tisha, back to you. Could the strategies that you outlined also be applied to communities that are experiencing in-migration from other regions from climate immigrants? For example, folks of economic means who are leaving hotter areas or areas impacted by wildfire and air quality issues, potentially impacting local housing costs and exacerbating affordability.
Absolutely. I think this is not just a coastal climate sea level rise displacement story. I think it's a displacement story broadly, and it's a migration story broadly. And communities across the United States, across the world, are going to have to figure out how to grapple with those that are moving from places that are either sacrificed or gone or uninhabitable into these new places. And I just sort of also want to offer, climate change is sort of, posited as a dark, gloomy thing, but there are also opportunities, right, for the receiving community. We're just sort of offering the position that we need to think about this before it happens to create more equitable outcomes. So we need to get ready for it. It is an opportunity for in-migration, more diverse communities, more economic investment and development, but we have to make sure that we keep equity at the focus so that there are not so many negative outcomes. So yeah, I think the strategies do make sense in most communities. We just sort of have to think about when we implement those strategies, how we implement them, and how we're going to fund it. I see a lot of questions around the funding, and I think that's a big hurdle that we all have to cross and think about the different types of mechanisms that we have right now and new mechanisms that we need in order to actually fund this very monumentous challenge.
Thank you. And one last plug for just another documentary that I recently watched because it's somewhat related. If you go on the Netflix and you can watch Descendant, if any of you have seen it yet, have any of you watched it yet? That are our panelists? No, you need to do it yesterday. You want to talk about environmental justice and the impacts of, potential climate issues to a minority community. Whew, that's it. It's right in your face, and it's a perfect example. So I urge everyone to go find it and watch it soon. Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and Carla for coordinating, and of course our cross collaboration of divisions for putting this SNR series together. As a reminder, we are recording the session. We'll post it on our YouTube channel on Monday. We'll also have slides available. Don't forget to log your SAM credits and register for all of our upcoming sessions. And you can get all the information that you need for all the things I just said on our website, which is ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. So thanks again to all of you. Thanks for everyone tuning in today. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk next.